The kind of silence that fills a private dining room at 11:30 at night isn't peaceful. It has weight to it. The clink of crystal, the soft percussion of silverware against porcelain, the murmur of conversations that could end careers, marriages, lives. All of it pressed down on Nessa Holt like something she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it wasn't hers. She moved through it the way she always did, quietly, efficiently, eyes down, order pad ready, smile fixed just wide enough to look pleasant without inviting conversation. That was the trick she'd learned in 4 years of working the private floor at Ember & Cole. Chicago's most expensive steakhouse, the kind of place where the breadsticks cost more than her hourly wage, and the wine list was longer than most legal briefs. Stay small, stay useful, stay invisible. For a woman who looked like Nessa, invisibility took some work. She wasn't built for blending in. She knew that. Round face, full hips, the kind of body that filled out a uniform in ways the restaurant's designer probably hadn't accounted for. She'd heard the whispers in the kitchen. Not cruel exactly, but thoughtless. The way people talk when they assume you can't hear, or worse, when they're certain you can and simply don't care. She cared. She just didn't let it show. What she showed instead was competence. 4 years of memorizing orders without writing them down. 4 years of knowing, without being told, that Mr. Harley at table 3 preferred his bourbon neat and his steak medium rare and his business partners to face the door. 4 years of reading a room the way other people read weather. Looking for the subtle shifts that signaled something was about to change. Tonight, she felt it before she understood it. The private dining room on the upper floor of Ember & Cole was reserved for parties of 10 or more, for corporate buyouts and anniversary dinners, and on the 3rd Thursday of every month, for a gathering that the reservation system listed simply as M. Vane. Standing reservation. Nessa had worked that booking 11 times. She knew what it meant. The men who arrived were never loud. That was the first thing that set them apart. Loud men, in her experience, were performing power. These men didn't perform anything. They settled into the room like they owned it, which, she suspected, in some functional sense they did, and they ordered with the quiet authority of people who had never once in their adult lives been told no. At the center of it all, always, was Maxon Vane. She had seen him exactly 11 times, and had never once made direct eye contact. That was also a trick she'd learned. Men like Maxon Vane noticed things. The wrong kind of notice could make your life complicated in ways that didn't resolve easily. He was somewhere in his early 40s, she guessed, though there was something about him that made age feel irrelevant. Dark hair, just beginning to silver at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone with strong opinions. He wore bespoke suits. She'd learned what that word meant because of him, actually, when she'd overheard his tailor discussing the construction of a jacket at the bar 2 years ago, and he wore them the way most men wore old t-shirts. Like it was just what he put on in the morning. His hands, she'd noticed, because she noticed everything, bore 2 small scars on the right knuckle line. Not the kind you got from kitchen accidents. She didn't think about what kind you did get from them. Tonight was supposed to be routine. Pour the water, take the orders, disappear between courses. She had done it so many times the choreography was automatic. Step left for the chair, reach right for the glass, smile and recede, smile and recede. She was pouring a second round of water for the far end of the table when she heard it. Not a full sentence, not even a full phrase, just a fragment, slipped out in the gap between 2 notes of the background jazz between one breath and the next. Confirmed his usual booth. Vane won't see it coming. The voice belonged to a man she didn't recognize. He was seated at the small auxiliary table near the east window. The add-on that sometimes got booked for overflow guests, for drivers, for associates, who ranked just below a seat at the main event. He was speaking into his phone, half turned away, one hand cupped loosely around his mouth, the way people did when they thought the gesture made them inaudible. It didn't. Nessa kept pouring. Her hand was steady. Her face was neutral. The water hit the glass at exactly the right angle. No splash, no spill. She walked back toward the service station, set the pitcher down, and pressed her palms flat against the cold steel countertop. His usual booth. The main table at Ember and Cole's private floor. The one Maxon Vane had occupied 11 times. The one with his back to the wall and sight lines to both exits, because men like him never sat any other way. Vane won't see it coming. Her heart was doing something strange. Not quite racing, more like stuttering, losing its rhythm the way a song did when a record skipped. She breathed through it. Methodical. She was good at methodical. She had 3 options, and she sorted through them with the same efficiency she used to sort the night's closing receipts. Option 1. She had misheard. The fragment meant something else entirely, something mundane, something that had nothing to do with the man currently eating dry-aged ribeye 12 feet away. Option 2. She had heard correctly, and it was not her problem. She was a waitress. She served food. She poured water. She went home at midnight and heated up leftovers and watched something forgettable on her phone and slept 5 hours and did it again. This was not her world. Option 3. She looked through the pass-through window at the main table. Maxon Vane was listening to something one of his men was saying, his expression giving nothing away. He held his bourbon glass loosely, the way people held things they weren't worried about dropping. He'd never snapped his fingers at her. That was the thing she kept coming back to, in the strange, slow-motion quality that had taken over her thoughts. 11 visits. 40-some service interactions. Not once had he treated her the way 90% of the men at that table did. Like furniture that occasionally brought food. He had said thank you once, without looking up, and the specificity of it had startled her so badly she'd nearly dropped the breadbasket. He'd said it like he meant it. Like it was just a thing he said to people who did things for him. She didn't know anything about Maxon Vane, beyond what a careful observer could collect in 11 evenings. She knew he drank Blanton's single barrel, neat, 2 glasses over the course of 4 hours, never more. She knew he read every document placed in front of him before signing it, no matter who was waiting. She knew he was the last to raise his voice and the first to be obeyed. She also knew, because she was a careful observer, that the man at the auxiliary table was still on his phone, and that he had just glanced toward the door in the way people did when they were expecting something to happen on a schedule. Nessa pulled a cocktail napkin from the stack beside the service station. She uncapped the pen she kept in her apron pocket, a plain black ballpoint, the same kind she'd been using since she started, and she wrote 4 words, pressing hard enough that the ink stayed clean and deliberate on the soft paper. Someone outside is waiting. She looked at it, added 3 more words beneath. Leave through the kitchen. She folded it once, just once, neat and flat. She picked up the small plate of salted butter that needed to go to the main table anyway, set the folded napkin underneath it, and walked out of the service station with the same measured pace she used for every other trip across that floor. She set the butter plate at the edge of the table, well within reach, and slid the folded napkin underneath the base, just as she placed it down. A motion so practiced, so folded into the ordinary gesture of putting a dish down, that anyone watching would have seen nothing. What she hadn't counted on was that Maxon Vane was already watching her. Not the way men usually watched her, if they watched her at all. Not an appraisal, not dismissal. He was watching her the way she watched rooms, looking for the thing that didn't fit, the variable that had changed. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she looked down, picked up an empty glass from the table's edge, and walked back to the service station. Her hands were shaking now. She pressed them flat again, counted her own breathing. The kitchen was loud behind her. The clatter and heat and orchestrated chaos of a restaurant at full service, and she focused on the specific sounds of it, the hood fan and the ticket printer and Emilio calling out a table number. because those were real and familiar and hers. She didn't look back. She heard, rather than saw, the shift at the main table about 90 seconds later. A shift in voices, a subtle drop in volume, a quickening undercurrent that didn't match the rhythm of a dinner conversation. Then the sound of chairs, then footsteps, then nothing from that direction at all. The man at the auxiliary table was still on his phone. She watched him from the corner of her eye as she restocked glasses at the station. He said something short and curt into the device, and then his posture changed. A new kind of stillness, the kind that was actually tension wearing a mask. She wondered what he'd been told. She wondered what was about to happen. She wondered if she'd made the worst mistake of her life, or the most necessary one, and she genuinely could not tell the difference. The shift ended at midnight. Nessa counted her tables, ran her side work, and was tying her apron strings out of habit when her manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Colette, appeared at her elbow and said, quietly, that there was someone waiting to speak with her. Not a customer complaint. The manager's face held something that wasn't quite alarm, but was in the general neighborhood of it. The someone was a man in a charcoal suit who introduced himself simply as Pell, and who walked her, politely, but with the firmness of someone accustomed to being obeyed, to a black car idling in the alley behind the restaurant. She thought about running, briefly, thought about what running would accomplish, decided against it. The car took her 12 minutes across the city to a building that looked, from the outside, like a converted warehouse. Brick and black steel, no signage, lights visible only on the upper floors. She was escorted through a ground-floor lobby that contained 2 men who didn't look at her, and a single elevator that required a key card. On the 4th floor, in a room that managed to be simultaneously minimal and expensive, Maxon Vane was seated behind a desk that held nothing but a glass of water and the folded cocktail napkin. He looked up when she was brought in. He studied her for a moment the way he'd studied the napkin when she imagined him first reading it, with complete, unhurried attention. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Tell me exactly what you heard," he said. "Exactly. Not your interpretation of it. The words," she told him. She had a good memory. Another tool in her invisibility kit, the ability to retain the precise texture of a moment long after it had passed. She repeated the fragment word for word. His usual booth, confirmed. Vane won't see it coming. He was quiet for a moment. He had the particular kind of stillness that suggested not the absence of thought, but the presence of a great deal of it, moving very fast beneath a perfectly calm surface. "The man at the east window table," he said. "Describe him." She did. She gave him height, build, approximate age, the color of his jacket, the phone, a newer model in a cracked black case, and the gesture he'd made with his left hand when he was listening. Maxon Vane watched her describe all of this with an expression she couldn't fully read, but which contained, she thought, something adjacent to surprise. "You noticed the phone case," he said. "I notice things," she said. "It's how I do my job." There was a pause that felt significant. "Why did you tell me?" he said. "It would have been easier not to." She thought about that. She'd been thinking about it, in some layer of her mind, since she walked back to the service station with shaking hands. The honest answer wasn't the safe one, and she wasn't sure safety was a concept that applied anymore regardless. "You said thank you once," she said, "when I brought the bread course about a year ago. You didn't look at me, but you said it like you meant it. Nobody at your table has said thank you in 4 years. She paused, and I heard his usual booth, and I thought, that's the seat where he can see both exits. And I thought if something happened and I'd said nothing, I'd spend the rest of my life thinking about those 2 exits. Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly. More like a recalibration. Like he'd been looking at something through glass and now the glass was gone. "Your name," he said. "Nessa Holt. You're a waitress at Ember and Cole for how long? 4 years. Before that?" "Accounting degree. Didn't work out." She paused. The firm I was with had some creative ideas about where client money should go. I filed a report. They fired me. Nobody in the industry wanted to touch me after that. Something moved behind his eyes at that. She couldn't name it. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at the napkin on the desk. Someone outside is waiting. Leave through the kitchen, written in neat block letters, because she'd never trusted her own handwriting under pressure. And pressure had been something she'd understood was present even before she'd fully processed why. "You know what I am," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have some general ideas," she said carefully. "And you still wrote the napkin." "I wrote it before I finished thinking about what you were," she said. "By the time I'd thought about it, the napkin was already under the butter dish." That earned her something she hadn't expected from him. Not a smile, exactly. She wasn't sure his face did that in the conventional sense. But the corners of his eyes shifted, just barely, and something in his posture changed by a degree or two, and she had the distinct impression that Maxon Vane found her, in some specific and particular way, surprising. She wasn't sure anyone found him surprising back, but she was going to try. He told her, in the following hour, more than she'd expected him to tell her. Not everything. She understood. There was an everything she would never have access to, but enough. The man at the east window table had been placed there, not by an enemy outside, by someone inside his organization who had decided that the third Thursday of the month represented an opportunity too tidy to pass up. She listened carefully. She asked 3 questions. He answered 2 of them, and the third one he looked at her for a moment before answering that one too. She was escorted back to her apartment at 2 in the morning. Pell waited at the curb until she was inside. She watched from her window as the car pulled away, and then she sat on her couch in her work clothes and her sensible shoes and looked at nothing for a while. It took her 3 days to hear from him again. He called. Not a text, an actual call, her number obtained by some method she decided not to examine. He said he had a proposal for her. She said she was listening. He said the words financial analyst and private consultation and compensation, followed by a number that made her spend 10 full seconds not speaking. "Why?" she said, when she'd recovered the use of language. "Because the person currently managing my books has been skim-in for 14 months, he said. "And because you once filed a report on your employer for doing exactly that, and it cost you your career, which tells me you're either honest or stubborn or both, and I find both qualities currently more useful than their alternatives." She thought about it. She thought about it for 3 days, which was exactly as long as the first time someone had asked her to do something that would rearrange her life. She said yes. It was not, she told herself, because of the way he had looked at her across his desk, like she was something that had snapped into focus. It was not because of the particular quality of his thank you, repeated now in her memory, with the significance that small things accumulate when you keep returning to them. It was because the accounting job was real, and the number was serious, and her apartment had a draft in the winter that her landlord had been ignoring for 2 years. She told herself that. The first 3 months were professional, rigorously, deliberately professional on her end and, she thought, on his in whatever way a man like Maxon Vane was capable of deliberateness in the direction of restraint. She went through his books with the focused intensity she brought to everything she did quietly. She found the skimming, 14 months of it, just as he'd said, nested in rounding errors and duplicate vendors with near-identical names. She presented her findings in a 20-page document, organized by date and method and total amount. He read all 20 pages, without looking up, without interrupting. When he was done, he set the document down and said, "How did you know to look at the vendor duplication?" "Old trick," she said. "Second oldest in the book. People think if the names are close enough, the numbers are close enough. They're usually wrong." She paused. "The oldest trick is the rounding errors, by the way." "Which your guy also used," which tells you something about how confident he thought he was. What does it tell you that he thought nobody was looking? She said. People get sloppy when they feel invisible. Another one of those recalibrations. That small shift in his expression, the one she'd started to recognize the way she recognized other things, the way a table was about to run out of bread, the way a room was about to turn. You keep using that word, he said. Which word? Invisible. She looked at him. It's a useful word, she said, for some people. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you've never been invisible to me. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it in the same folder she'd been putting things since the night of the napkin. A folder she tried not to open, because opening it led to thoughts that weren't useful and feelings that were significantly less controlled than her accounting work. The folder was getting crowded. She met his men over those months. Not all of them. The ones she was meant to meet. The ones relevant to the financial work. She learned their names and their functions, and she learned, with the same precision she brought to vendor databases, which ones looked at her with the specific dismissiveness she'd been reading her whole life. Too much, too soft, too visible in the wrong ways. And which ones took their cue from Maxon Vane and treated her accordingly. There was a man named Croft. She never learned a first name, who had opinions about her presence that he communicated through exactly the kind of subtle performance she'd been reading since she was 19 years old. The overly formal address. The questions directed to the room rather than to her. The slight emphasis on assistant in a way that removed any professional weight from the word. She ignored it. She was good at ignoring it. She had the kind of practice that came from years of people looking through her, as if looking at something more interesting on the other side. What she wasn't prepared for was Maxon Vane noticing. She was in his office, a different room from the first night. A working office this time, book-lined and lived in, with 2 chairs arranged in a way that said someone had thought about comfort. Going through the second quarter projections when Croft knocked and entered with something that apparently required a word, and conducted his half of the conversation in the way he always did, and left. The room was quiet for a moment. Does he bother you? Maxon asked. She looked up from the projections. Does who bother me? You know who. She considered lying. It would have been easy. She was good at making her face neutral. No, she said. He looked at her in the particular way he had, the way that made her feel uncomfortably, like he could read the filing system she kept her feelings in, not the contents but the structure of it, the fact of it. He won't be in these meetings anymore, he said. It's not necessary. No, he said. It's not, which is why it'll happen. She went back to the projections. After a moment, she said, without looking up. Thank you. I meant it, he said. She did look up at that. He was already reading something else, or appearing to, but the corner of his expression held that shift again, the one that wasn't quite a smile. She thought about the budget folder a lot that evening. The thing about the world she'd walked into was that it had a specific kind of pressure in it, not the dramatic kind she'd imagined before. She'd had imagination about it, back when Ember and Cole's private floor was the closest she got. It wasn't all cars in alleys and folded napkins under butter plates. Most of it was bureaucratic, actually, in a way she was temperamentally suited to. The paperwork of power, the logistics of it. Who owed what to whom, and what form that owing took, and how to make the accounting of it invisible to people looking for it from the outside. She was very good at that last part. 6 months in, she understood enough to know that the attempt on Maxon's life that night at Ember and Cole had come from inside. She'd understood that much from the first conversation. What she understood now was the specific inside, the shape of the betrayal, the name attached to it. His second-in-command, a man named Aldrin Haskey, who had been with him for nearly a decade, and who had decided, at some point in the last 2 years, that waiting for something was preferable to waiting for permission. She didn't ask how Maxon dealt with it. She understood that there were things she would be told, and things that would remain in the part of his life that existed behind a door she wasn't meant to open. She was fine with that. She had her own closed doors. She didn't expect him to audit them. What she hadn't expected was that Haskell's removal would create a position, or that Maxon would, 2 weeks after the fact, sit across from her in the working office and explain the position to her in the careful way he explained things, fully without condescension, and then look at her with the quiet expectation of someone who already knew what the answer was going to be, but wanted to give her the respect of asking anyway. "You want me to be your CFO," she said. "I want you to be the person who tells me when I'm being lied to," he said. "The title is secondary." "The title is CFO. The title is CFO," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. "I filed a report once," she said, "on an employer, for doing the kind of creative accounting your previous financial people were doing for you. It ended my career in a legitimate firm." "I know," he said. "And you're asking me to do essentially the same work." "I'm asking you to do it for someone who won't fire you for it," he said. "I'm asking you to find every inconsistency and bring it to me directly. And I will deal with it and no one will fire you." She looked at the projections spread between them, at the numbers she'd spent 6 months learning, the shape of them, the patterns she could now read the way she read rooms, at the window behind him where the Chicago skyline did its specific thing with late afternoon light. "You need a better expense reporting system," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll build you one," she said, "and I'll take the position. But I want an office with a window. Done. And I want Croft reassigned to something that doesn't involve these meetings." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted into the territory she hadn't learned to name yet. Something that was past the recalibration, past the corners of his eyes. Something that looked, very carefully, like the beginning of being known. "Already done," he said. The office had 2 windows. She found that out the following Monday, when Pell walked her to a corner room on the 3rd floor, with a view of the river on one side, and the city on the other, a desk that was the right height for someone who wasn't 6 feet tall, and a small plant in a terracotta pot on the windowsill that had no business being there, and that she later learned had been placed there by Maxon himself, because he had noticed that she had 2 small succulents on her apartment windowsill. On the one occasion, Pell had walked her home, and she'd briefly forgotten to close the curtain before turning on the light. He'd noticed. She sat at the new desk and looked at the 2 windows and the terracotta pot and felt something that wasn't quite comfortable and wasn't quite something larger and wasn't, she told herself firmly, anything that should be named before she was certain of it. She was very good at not naming things before she was certain. The gala was 6 weeks later. Maxon's annual event. She'd read about it in the periphery of other documents, a charity function that served multiple purposes simultaneously, which was the kind of efficiency she appreciated architecturally, even when she was apprehensive about her own role in it. She hadn't planned on attending. She was the CFO of an organization that didn't exactly issue press releases. Gala attendance seemed like a category error. He had other ideas. "You'll come," he said, not a question, but also, she noticed, and she noticed everything. He waited. "I'm not," she started. "You'll come," he said again, and then, in the slight shift that was his version of softening, "I'd like you there." She went. She found a dress on a Wednesday evening, alone, in a boutique that was too expensive and too quiet, and she stood in front of a mirror in a deep burgundy silk, not green. She'd decided that immediately, not the color every story seemed to assign to women who looked like her, as if there were a dress code for the genre, and looked at herself for a while. She looked like herself. That was the thing. Full shoulders, full hips, the face she'd been looking at her whole life with the complicated relationship she'd been having with it for most of that time. The silk moved differently than the uniform. It moved like it had an opinion. She bought it. The gala was held in a ballroom, that had never in its history hosted anything understated. Crystal and candlelight, and the particular hum of rooms where real power went to perform itself for an evening. She stood at the edge of it in her burgundy silk and watched, because watching was what she did, and the room told her its stories the way rooms always did. Who deferred to whom, where the real conversations were happening, which smiles contained genuine warmth, and which were load-bearing. He found her at the edge of the room within 7 minutes of her arrival. She knew because she'd been timing, the way she timed things when she was nervous and didn't want it to show. He was in a black suit that was exactly as well constructed as the ones she'd observed across 11 dinners and 6 months of meetings, and he looked at her. The burgundy silk, the full length of her, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something open, something that hadn't been routed through the careful machinery she'd learned to look past. "You look," he started and stopped, which was something she had never seen him do before. Stop in the middle of a sentence. "Burgundy," she said, because she needed to say something, and that was the truest available option. "Yes," he said. He offered his arm. "Come." She took it. They moved through the room, and something happened that she'd spent years failing to prepare herself for, which was that the room rearranged itself around them. Not around her. She understood that, was careful to understand that, but them, the composite of them together. People looked, and the looking was a different quality than any look she'd learned to navigate. Halfway through the evening, standing at the edge of the terrace with the city spread below them, and the noise of the ballroom reduced to a soft background hum, Maxon said, without preamble, "My former advisor told the people who were waiting outside that I'd be at that table for another 40 minutes. She looked at him. "He told them you were just a waitress," he said, "that you wouldn't see anything, and that even if you did, it wouldn't matter." She was quiet for a moment. He was wrong on both counts. He was, Maxon said. He fundamentally misunderstood the function of someone who has spent years being looked through. He looked at her directly, the full force of the attention he usually distributed in careful, measured increments. That's not invisibility. That's intelligence wearing patience. And I have never, in a long career of evaluating people, met anyone who wielded it better than you. Nessa Holt had spent 31 years being good at not letting things show. She let this one show. Not everything. She wasn't there yet. They weren't there yet. There was a there that had a shape she was beginning to understand the dimensions of. But she wasn't going to name it before she was certain, and she was maybe 80% certain, which was closer than she'd been to anything in years. But she let this one show, the way his words landed, the fact that they had. He was watching her do it. He was watching her the way she'd watched rooms her whole life. Carefully, fully, without looking away, and something in his face did the thing that wasn't a smile, and was more than a smile, and that she was going to need time, she thought, to adequately categorize. "Thank you," she said. Simply, like he had once, across 11 dinner services, like she meant it. "I meant it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at the city behind him, at the specific way this night had arrived in her life, through a kitchen pass-through, and a ballpoint pen, and 4 words on a cocktail napkin. "I know," she said. The woman who had learned to walk quietly, through rooms full of people who looked past her, stood on that terrace in burgundy silk, at the edge of Maxon Vane's world, and understood, with the precise and particular certainty she brought to the things that mattered, that she was not standing at the edge of anything anymore. She was standing exactly where she was supposed to be.